Conversations That Matter is a partner program of the Center for Dialogue at Simon Fraser University. The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you.
Welcome. Very interesting time to be having this discussion about what the city of the future is going to look like. We just elected a new prime minister who, what appears to be a change from the previous government, has said that he's going to put more attention and more money into helping to reshape cities for the future. What are the components that we have to be looking at when we start to think about what is the city of the future?
Well, it's a great question, and it's really a very complicated one because the city is an organism in many ways. It consists of a whole number of elements that operate by their own principles and their own dynamics. And sometimes we've applied overly simplistic ways of understanding and influencing those things and not really recognize the interrelationships and the complexities of those. So it involves everything from planning, from planning decisions to how things are going to be funded, to which levels of government are going to have a voice at the table. But of course, at the other end of the spectrum is what role should the community play in shaping those decisions, and how are they going to feel connected to those decisions?
But no matter what we do, it has to fit into the whole. And so there has to be that much broader discussion. Otherwise we get what I guess has been the historical development of cities. I need this, I'll build it, there it is.
Yeah. And too much of the way we've shaped our cities is by, it's almost the negative response. We've done things where there's been less pushback, as opposed to really shaping the city and the region from a vision. And say, this is what we want. This is what we're aspiring to be, not what we are now. And how are we going to get from here to that aspirational vision? We don't really have that discussion very often. We're looking at things in isolation. We're looking at, here's a development application, here's a decision about a street, here's a local decision. And too often we forget the big picture. We don't look at it through that broader lens.
So what does the future look like when it comes to cities? Do we have to accept the fact that density has to be part of that, like increased density?
I think it's unquestionably the case. More and more people are moving to the city. This is a global, phenomenon, if you call it, that people are leaving the rural areas, they're moving to cities. We're becoming increasingly urbanized as a civilization, as a species. And that's not going to change. The forces that are driving people to the city are fundamental to our systems and to the way we live. Our cities are going to become increasingly dense, and they need to become increasingly dense. But I guess what I look at is, rather than look at that as a negative and say, what's going to change, look at it as a positive and say, well, how can we use that as an opportunity to create the type of city that we want to have? Change will happen. It's far better to have an influence in directing that change in a way that's leading to a much more positive outcome. Because if we just say, no, we're afraid of change, we're not going to allow change, that change will happen inadvertently and will have the unintended consequences, which in most cases are worse.
Because it happens from a reactionary perspective. Oh, I got a problem, let me fix it.
That's right.
And I'll address that. Yeah. But who knows what the spreading out consequences of that decision will be.
Yeah, there's two types, I'd say. There's certainly that, and there's also just sometimes doing nothing causes change, and we don't necessarily anticipate those changes as well.
Right. So, but we live in a world where I think it's almost half the world's population now is living in cities. And in Canada, I think it's more like 70%. So you start in Canada, the United States, Europe, if we see around the world that we're going to get to 70, 75, maybe even 80% of the people living in cities, how do we design those cities? What's the process that we have to go through to ensure that those cities are actually going to work? Because you go to many major urban centers in North America right now and you try to do business, if you have to move from point A to point B during the course of the day, your cost of just getting from one spot to the next is enormously high. So how do we, get from where we are to developing those systems that are going to work?
Ultimately, we'll end up in rethinking our relationship to the automobile. Currently our cities have been designed and planned and built out on this false assumption that we can build forever, we can spread out as far as, and we'll just take our car there. And what we're recognizing is that actually is not the way to build the types of communities that we value and frankly can afford. So it starts from really thinking differently and looking at at this era that we've been, really over the last 50 to 75 years of city making, is the anomaly. We need to get back to some fundamental principles about what are cities about. Well, they're about accommodating people, and they're about accommodating commerce, but they're about accommodating life and all aspects of life. We've designed our cities for the needs of, from an engineering standpoint, for the needs of the automobile, the needs of moving, fire trucks in and out, those types of needs. We haven't, and it's changing, and I think we're really lucky in Vancouver because there's a much greater awareness about how we utilize design in creating vibrant, important public spaces. But we can do much better.
You touched on an interesting point about building around the automobile. It allows us to spread out and allows us to move around in the city. But I don't know if you saw the news, Oslo has become the world's first city to now say no more automobiles in the city.
Yeah, which is fascinating. And
Yeah.
which I think it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out. But Oslo has also systematically changed the way they've seen their downtown core, and they've introduced gradually different series of regulations and steps that have made that transformation happen. So, for instance, policies around when you can bring your automobile into the city, or restricting how many lanes are available. Now, we're starting to do those types of things here. Examples like the bike lanes, for instance, which have been quite controversial, but now we're used to them, and I think they're working very, very well. You can't change a city overnight. You have to do it with very slow and deliberate processes that span over years. If you look at cities like Copenhagen or Amsterdam or Oslo, these are cities that made a commitment years ago to change the nature of their cities, and they did it deliberately and slowly and gradually so that it wouldn't disrupt all of the existing systems. People would have to adapt, and sure, there might be some resistance here and there. But people then also started to see the advantages of those changes and really want those changes and be willing to take the risks and to embrace them. And that's what we need. We need an overarching vision and a commitment that is going to take a generation to unfold. It's not going to be in any one term. It's not going to be any one year. It's not any one government's responsibility. It's the community saying, this is the vision that we want for our children and their children, for our city. How do we get there?
We got to take a quick break here for commercials. We'll be right back.
Conversations That Matter is a not-for-profit program made possible thanks to the charitable support of the following and from viewers like you. Please visit conversationsthatmatter.tv and help us to continue to produce this program. Thank you.
We talked about density. If we take a look at a city like Vancouver, we have pockets where we're very dense, but we're going to have to see increased densification, especially if we want to have those mass transit systems. They have to be supplying a significant portion of the population with the means to get around. And so does that mean that we also have to change our view of what we call home?
Well, that's a great, absolutely, and I think that you're hitting on a really, really important issue, and that's about expectations. What have we come to expect in our homes? So from the early 1970s to now, the average house size in the country has gone from about 1,100 square foot to 2,500 square feet, using round numbers.
That's the average.
The average. At the same time, the occupants per household has dropped from about 3.5 to 2.5.
Yeah.
So when you look at the average square foot per person in the average Canadian home, it's almost 3 times what it was in the houses that we grew up in. Now, our needs haven't changed. Our expectations have changed. And so unless and until we're willing to actually question our expectations, we're not going to solve the problem, right? This sort of North American dream of the house with the picket fence and the front lawn is not necessarily achievable. Our systems are based on an assumption that not only is it achievable, but it's a right. The reality,
and economically or environmentally, it's not a very friendly way to go.
Absolutely. From an environmental standpoint, we can't afford it. From an economic standpoint, we can't afford it. So that's where this next round of city making in the city of Vancouver is going to be particularly challenging, because most of the change has happened in areas where there haven't been existing populations or existing single-family stock. The easily developed lands are disappearing, but the need for change is going to keep going. So the conversations get more and more complicated when you go into an existing neighborhood and try to find a way to
And say,
introduce
all those
change.
houses,
Yeah.
I see high-rises. There's going to be a
doesn't even-
reaction.
But it doesn't even have to be high-rise. You know, there's many forms of housing that would increase the density and accommodate a much more vibrant and dynamic community. People immediately go to high-rise and say, "Oh my God, we don't want, you know, this thing in our backyard." And in many communities, that's a completely fair reaction. But that's actually not the alternative. You know, we've already seen laneway houses and secondary suites and things be introduced that people come to accept and think are actually help the community. We need a wider diversity of housing types, more intensification of the land that's already there. It doesn't have to be high-rise, doesn't even have to be mid-rise. It can be, you know, changing the way we use our single-family neighborhoods. We're going to have to get creative, and that's going to be a challenge. We're going to have to open up some discussions that are uncomfortable, and we're going to have those discussions in a really sort of mature fashion as a community.
I got to get you to hang on for just a second. We've got to take one more quick break. We'll be right back.
Conversations That Matter is a not-for-profit program made possible thanks to the charitable support of the following and from viewers like you. Please visit conversationsthatmatter.tv and help us to continue to produce this program. Thank you.
So which discussions are uncomfortable from your perspective?
Well, you know, NIMBYism is pretty well entrenched, you know, and people are afraid of change. They're not looking at change as an opportunity. And so we're going to have to find a way to explain how, by accepting change in your neighborhood actually is going to improve. It's not going to get worse. You're going to be able to walk to services, to walk to the cafe, enjoy those things. Right now, people are really only seeing it as the change as being negative. But in many situations, that change will actually be a positive to people's quality of life. And we need to tell that story in a much more profound way. We need to show them how making that choice will actually improve their quality of life, not harm it.
So if I have one of those 2,500 square foot homes that I'm a single family occupant in, but now all of a sudden the city says to me, which they are starting to do, well, you can build a laneway house and you can have a secondary suite and you can even have one other person in there. Maybe I'm going, okay, with the cost of housing, those become mortgage helpers as well. So it allows me also to own real estate and live in the place that I want to call home.
Well, exactly. And it allows for, you know, children to stay close to their parents and elderly to, you know, age in place. All sorts of benefits come from allowing a variety of unit types within our single family neighborhoods.
So how do we develop this so that also, because we've gotten kind of, I think, comfortable with the idea that Vancouver's a pretty safe city. There's always a fear of, well, if I densify, if I bring more people in, am I also inviting other troubles? So what are the things that we can do through design, through forward thinking, that ensure that as we build out that city, we're building it out in a way that still remains like freely livable in the sense of, like, this is Vancouver, for instance. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I know,
here,
I know what you're
you
saying.
know?
Again, and again, it's the fears.
Yeah.
You know, in many cases unfounded, but still legitimate concerns that people have, and that we have to be able to be able to respond to. And I guess what I would say is that if we're building the fabric of the community, if we're building a cohesive community where people know their neighbors and they care about their community, with that comes safety, with that comes security. If we're building alternatively, if we're on a path where we're pulling people apart, we're disconnecting people, and they're forcing them into automobiles, they're much less likely to know their neighbors and to support one another. So in fact, you know, I think what history and experience will show is that even modest increases in density from some of our current neighborhoods will result in greater neighborhood and community cohesion, which will ultimately be a safer community than the ones that we currently have.
Now, I want to talk about something that I know is important to you, and that is usable spaces, usable public spaces. It's not something that we've done particularly well in Canadian cities. Vancouver would be an example. There's some, but where and how do we improve that?
Well, we haven't done a very good job of building public space. We haven't valued it. We haven't made it a priority. We've looked at the recent history of the development, and we've looked at, you know, the contributions, the amenity contributions from those, to build a whole array of really needed public services. And in some cases, it's been parks. But we haven't had a policy that said, no, we need to create public space a network of public spaces, large, small, throughout our city. And that could be by closing a section of a street, or there's any number of different ways of creating those types of public spaces. But again, that needs to be a policy, a deliberate policy that says this is really important and we need to do this over time. If you look at a city like Amsterdam, for example, they've transformed their city and created networks of really rich public space. Really, by rich I mean vibrant, full of life, welcomes all aspects of society. Also accommodates transportation in transit and bicycles and cars. But they're people first spaces, and so we need to look to how do we transform our current network of streets and make them people focused rather than automobile focused.
Final break, promise. This is a very interesting topic, and I wish we could just keep going, but one last break. We'll be right back.
Conversations That Matter is a not-for-profit program made possible thanks to the charitable support of the following and from viewers like you. Please visit conversationsthatmatter.tv and help us to continue to produce this program. Thank you.
Give me a definition of what a public space is, because I can see people thinking, oh, another park. I don't want just a park. And that's not what we're talking about.
No, we actually have lots of parks, and that's not to say we wouldn't want more, but we're blessed with nature all around us. But by public space, we really mean spaces where people can just be, where they can congregate, where festivals can take place, where demonstrations can take place. Spaces where you'd think of them in the European context, like the town square, or this, the hard surface squares with fountains would be what people have in their minds. But really, what they are is they're congregation places. They're places where people can come together and be part of a larger community, and it can accommodate small gatherings and large gatherings. And so we need to create a network of all of those types of spaces. So we've valued our parks, we valued our nature, we valued things like the seawall. And as wonderful as the seawall is on many levels, it's 40 or 50 kilometers of the same type of experience. And it's an experience that isn't a static one. It's designed to keep you moving and actually to not stop and interact with your neighbor. Those happen far less frequently.
Yeah, you're just passing.
That's right.
Yeah.
So we need to create those moments where we can stop, pause, rest, bump into people. Those are really, really important.
So why is it important to do that? Like, what does that bring to a sense of community?
Well, it's those chance encounters. It's actually a whole series of things at various scales. Running into a neighbor, or sitting down having a cup of coffee and starting a conversation with somebody that you might not know, realizing you have common interests. That one interaction in itself is questionably valuable in terms of the big picture. But when you aggregate all of those little experiences that take place within those spaces, and you add them all together, that's where the impact comes. It's not from any one experience.
As you're saying that, I'm casting my mind back to a time one year when I was walking through Leicester Square in London, and I was overwhelmed by the incredible amount of human activity. We don't have that, but it does bring a level of energy and a sense of belonging.
And that doesn't happen by accident. It happens through design.
Mm-hmm.
And Leicester Square is a great example, because even if you look at Leicester Square today and you look at Leicester Square 25 years ago, they're very different places.
Mm-hmm.
And they've made a series of decisions to bias towards the pedestrian and the public realm.
Mm-hmm. One other thing that I think about is we have a network of alleyways in the downtown core that seem to go dramatically underutilized.
I think you've hit on what is a tremendous opportunity for the city. Our laneways, particularly in the downtown core, are highly underutilized in my view. And if you look at cities like Sydney or Melbourne in Australia, where they've recognized the potential of those to not just be about service but about life, and they've encouraged restaurants, bars, shops in those areas. Some of the most interesting portions of the city fabric are in those lanes. We have those opportunities. Our office is near the corner of Granville and Hastings, And I make a point of using the lanes to walk around, to just experience them. And I can tell you that particularly in that central area of the city, there's some lanes that crisscross Granville Street that are just ready for that opportunity. There's very little vehicular access on those lanes already, just because of the way that they've developed. They would be absolutely fantastic. So that's an example of thinking differently, thinking creatively, and saying, here's an opportunity. It doesn't involve, buying a really, really expensive piece of real estate, knocking down the building and building a square. It says, we already have this. We already own this. Let's think of this a little bit differently. It doesn't actually take that much to make big change. Those are the types of incremental changes that we can have tremendous results from. Thinking about the lanes, the sidewalks, street intersections.
Well, I think of also that from a safety perspective. If you start injecting life into those spaces, it's not a place for those with a criminal intent to be able to lurk and hide.
Absolutely.
Because they get moved out of there because there's real life happening there.
Exactly. And so there's tremendous benefit from that as well. We're starting to see some of that. Even the transformation in the Gastown area in the last 25 years has been quite positive. You look, that vibrancy and the restaurants, and some of the most interesting restaurant culture and cafe culture is in Gastown, and that's giving us a clue. And that's saying, the people are there, the demand is there. It now takes the vision to say that's the type of city we want more of. How do we create more of that?
So if I'm an individual and I say, okay, I want to get involved, I want to be a part of this, what's your recommendation on how somebody can become a contributor to making change?
Well, there's a whole series of discussions that take place just about any week. You can find an event where somebody's talking about the future of the city or about things that matter. And so look for it, participate in it. You can also create your own conversation. Bring your neighbors together and say, what type of city do you want? Insist upon it from all of our elected officials. It's really encouraging the new federal government and the language that's coming from Justin Trudeau in terms of recognizing the federal government's role in cities, and really hopeful that from that, by taking an interest and accepting a responsibility for it, and of course with that should come resources, it's going to force discussions that we haven't had. And that will be really, really welcome. And so they'll be there. So people, if they're paying attention, they should find ways of getting involved. And the other thing I would say is that, the next time that development sign goes up down the street, try not to fear it. Have your concerns, but look at it as say, how can I help shape this process to make the city better? How can I try to influence this decision, not to say no to everything, but to say, this is an opportunity to improve my quality of life. Look for those opportunities. They're there.
In other words, it's my city too. I should get involved.
Absolutely. We all have a responsibility.
Thank you very much. Appreciate you coming in and doing this.